I took Kate's tour this morning, and I feel like I'm on such a high. It gave me chills. And so did people on the bus, who were a lot of people from here who could bring us up to date with what happened to this whole area and these buildings. And oh, I live over there, and I went to that church, and that was just, it was so exciting to make the connections. So it's an honor to be here. I just am truly privileged. Think about it a minute. The two most important citizens in upstate New York are Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And you say, and they both were born on the eastern shore of Maryland? What the heck is happening on the eastern shore and in upstate New York that should bring these? I mean, I'm getting chills as I'm talking about this. I still can't believe it. But here we are. So to take the bus tour this morning and hear all these names, Tubman, Stewart, Ross, I said, I know all these people because they live near me. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a bit on how Harriet Tubman came to be in upstate New York. The first settlers of Auburn's always said John von Valkenburg, who was white. But he brought 6 people in slavery with him who are also the first settlers of Auburn. And so many people continued to live there after the end of slavery in New York State in 1927. But there were also many people who came up. One of the stereotypes we all have about the Underground Railroad is everybody went to Canada. Not everybody went to Canada. A lot of people estimated, one person estimated 20,000 people who escaped from slavery settled in northern states, many of them in New York State, and several dozen of them in Auburn. And another pattern that you'll see is that many people went to Canada, as Tubman did, and then came back and settled in New York State. And that's a very common pattern that we're beginning to find out from recent research as well. And in many ways, she was an unusual person. She was a woman in a world that people used to talk mostly about men. And she was a woman who was a leader, but not in traditional avenues of power. AME Zion Church still talks about servant leadership, and they use her as an example of that kind of person, a model for us all. She was a disabled person, and I think in many ways that's challenging to me to think about. How do you, if you have frontal lobe epilepsy and are subject to seizures and hearing voices, how do you integrate that into your life and just go on? She's not a wimp, that's for sure. A 5-foot black woman, some of her pictures by the 60s show her, it looks like scoliosis of the spine. She must have been in considerable pain by the time she's elderly. Her arthritis is so bad she can't even walk. She never complains about that. You don't know that unless you look at those photographs or talk to someone else who knew her. And I think the thing we honor her most for is not what she, not the disabilities, not the fact that she was black, a woman, short, born in slavery, but what she did. And she kept going back and back and back to bring out her family. At least 13 times. And if you think about the quality of leadership in a way, it's quintessentially nurturing. Her leadership is to carry out love for your family, your friends, your community in an active way. And it becomes a different way of leadership, and we honor her for that, and I don't think we quite as a country have absorbed the enormity of the quality of what she did and can do. On the other hand, I think we also, in terms of mythologizing her, tend to think she was so different that she wasn't like anyone else. And yet when you start looking at the Underground Railroad and the patterns in New York State that we see, you see most of the people who settled in New York came from the Upper South, some from Virginia, but most of them from Maryland. So that she's very typical in that way. She was motivated by the idea of freedom and safety for herself and her family, and she included her family and her community in that. And she went first to Canada and then came back to New York. That's a very typical pattern for people escaping from slavery as they come to New York State. But she also represents more than just a model person who escaped from slavery, she becomes a role model for all of us as Americans and as citizens of this world. Milton Cernett, who's written a recent book on Tubman and how the myth became memory and turned into history, argues that her story was truly an American one, representing the struggle of Americans to bring our ideals in closer harmony with the lived experience of every citizen, regardless of race, gender, or class. Tubman's story remains, he says, the quintessentially American story. I think that we can begin to see how true or untrue that might be when we think about the ideals on which this country was founded. The Declaration of Independence incorporates in the preamble the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all of us are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. People like Harriet Tubman, who devoted their lives to the ideals of freedom and making them real, become for us a model that invites us and challenges us to think about what those ideals mean in our lives today in this country and in the world.